Caffeine is considered a psychoactive drug, which means that it affects your brain function. And many of us consume it in the form of coffee, tea, but there are lots of other sources that you might not expect, such as cola. So that late night soda might be exactly what's keeping you awake, even if you're someone that says, well, it's too late for a coffee at this time of night. So caffeine is a drug that we all know is supposed to increase your focus, your alertness, and can actually increase your athletic performance. Does this by attaching to adenosine receptors within the central nervous system, and that influences other chemicals in the brain, such as dopamine. Examples of this could be high concentrations of dopamine in areas of the brain that we know are associated with attention span, thus increasing motor functions and providing us with anti-fatigue effects. But many of us also experience negative effects, such as getting the jitters, feeling quite anxious, feeling nervy, insomnia, and even heart palpitations. A 2024 study also suggested that it has all the traits of an addictive substance, so addiction is possible with caffeine, potentially explaining why some of us stay hooked on the stuff even though it doesn't really make us feel good and you get that anxious, jittery feeling. Even though the longer you use it, the more that you use it, it becomes less and less of an effect. Other potential benefits include the increased fat oxidation, effectively a fancy way of saying your body using fat for energy. However, this only seems to work when subjects are fasted. So if you've eaten anything, that won't happen. Interestingly, a systematic review that was published in the Nutrients journal found that even a placebo dose of caffeine, which means they weren't given any caffeine at all, they were just told that they were given caffeine, increased their athletic performance in terms of letting them push mentally to their aerobic maximum, which is effectively when you're huffing and puffing and you feel like you're absolutely at your peak, then you can go a little bit further just because you think you have caffeine in your system. And they had less feelings of fatigue even though they didn't have the drug. So that suggests there's some sort of mentality shifts that can actually influence our athletic performance in some way, affecting the central nervous system to help us go further. So does that suggest that many of us can just become better athletes without actually taking anything and instead having some sort of mental shift? So if you've ever found yourself in a situation where your usual cup of coffee is out of reach, or perhaps you stayed over a friend's house and they are not tea or coffee drinkers and they have none in the house, you've likely experienced the withdrawal effects of a headache, which people usually describe as a moderate pain, which is quite throbbing pain. But what causes that? Well, evidence suggests that it's obviously to do with the amount of caffeine that you do consume on a regular basis. However, it's also associated with changes in body mass index, which is related to weight and your height, where actually the higher your body mass index, meaning that you're more likely to have a heavier body weight for your height, the greater your chance is of developing withdrawal headaches, which is quite interesting because usually, even when you're talking about things like alcohol, if you have a friend who's a lot bigger than you, you know that they can probably outdrink you unless there's some sort of other factor involved. And yet these withdrawal symptoms seem to affect larger people more, suggesting that caffeine actually affects larger people more. And unfortunately for some, females are much more likely to get these withdrawal headaches than males. However, the actual cause of these headaches once you withdraw from caffeine is still unknown. Yet clues do seem to point at the blood vessels within the brain. And when you suddenly stop consuming caffeine, your vessels dilate, which means they get wider, and that allows more blood through. So why does that happen? It's because caffeine is what you call a vasoconstrictor, which means that it narrows your blood vessels. So all those little vessels in your brain, which normally feed it with blood and oxygen and all the nutrients that you need to survive, suddenly there's massive increase in that. When you consume caffeine, they get smaller in diameter. That means that less blood can get through, but potentially it'll be a higher pressure. So suddenly when you stop having that caffeine, all those vasoconstrictive effects no longer are at play. And once that last little bit of residual caffeine that's laying around in your system has finally been broken down, then you might start getting the symptoms of the headache because blood flow is increasing to your brain, and that expansion is what's currently believed to be the cause of the pain. So if you do want to give up caffeine, how do you do it? This is somewhere that I have a lot of personal experience because I seem to go through phases of heavy intake, periods where I go, I've had too much for too long and I'm starting to get quite jittery every day. I'm starting to feel a bit angsty, so I need to stop for a little while. Perhaps you start feeling palpitations and it starts to make you nervous because everyone thinks anything to do with the heart is obviously a bit sketchy. So while these palpitations might not be harmful for someone with a healthy heart who wants to tempt fate. Now, personally, I would say the worst way to do this is to go cold turkey, because you're going from, I don't know, say 3, 4, 5 cups a day, a lot of milligrams of caffeine, all the way to 0. Then you're going to have such a massive effect of that vasodilation, which I said is the expansion of the vessels, increasing that blood flow to the area, that you're probably going to get quite severe migraines potentially, quite sharp stabbing pains, and quite intense throbbing pain too. So the best thing to do is, if you have 4, say, then come back to 3 for a couple of days, then go to 2 for a couple of days, 1. But once you get to 1, it's important not to just go to 0. You can try it by all means. You still have quite a massive jump from 1 cup to 0. So then what you can try is half a teaspoon of normal caffeinated coffee, half a teaspoon of decaffeinated. And by doing that, you're kind of getting half the amount that you normally would, but you're still getting this full taste of the cup. Very carefully, you kind of go a little bit less on the caffeine over a few days, and then eventually you want to go completely decaf. But the interesting thing is that when people say, I drink decaffeinated things, that doesn't actually mean they don't get any caffeine. Decaffeinated things don't have 0 caffeine in. They have somewhere between 1/4 to 1/3 of a normal cup of coffee. So say if you have 3 a day that are all decaf, you're potentially getting enough to be 1 full cup of caffeinated. So then once you've gone to decaf, then obviously again, cut back on the numbers if you're still having multiple a day, before eventually going back to 1, and then you can cut off to 0, because you're only getting that small jump from 1/4 or 1/3 of a normal cup down to 0, maybe 20, 30, 40 milligrams of caffeine, as opposed to going from a full 1 cup to 0, which is about, 200 to 400 milligram drop. So if this is something that you tried before and you've bailed due to the horrible pains, or if you simply want to experiment how reliant you've become on coffee and see what happens, hopefully this will help you reduce your intake or completely wean yourself off of caffeine and return to your baseline without the added anxiety or the increased irritability, with an increased ability to actually relax, even if it's at the cost of your athletic performance, since you'll probably make up for that by getting a better night of sleep rather than having the drug work in your system, because it has a half-life of somewhere between 4 and 6 hours. So if you're having 200 milligrams, 400 milligrams, it takes 4 to 6 hours before half of that is left in your system. After that 6 hours, maybe you have one at 9 a.m. in the morning, 6 hours before half of that's left, so you might still have 100 milligrams going through your system. Then another 4 to 6 hours, you'll have about 50 milligrams. So it's like an exponential decay, meaning that it halves and halves and halves over a few hours at a time. So 1 cup in the morning could affect your body for over 12 hours. So yes, 1 cup in the morning could be affecting the next night of sleep as well, because it lasts so long in your body, creating a cycle of tiredness and negative health.